So, what is a possible way that you might incur costs, we'll say, for if a potential US CBDC is to come about, right? And basically where we're going with this is the actual physical hardware that it comes, and more specifically the security that comes along with it, right? And so you might have, say, like a separate module, as an example, to operate your CBDC, whether that be like some form of digital wallet or whatever. If they decide to go a more hardware-based route to security for the CBDC system, they could also go more software-based, but that'll be a separate video to talk more about that in general. And for general context, a lot of this information is coming from a recent paper published from the Office of Science and Technology from the White House, and that itself will be linked in the description below, as always, so you guys, the actual PDF version, so you guys can read it for yourselves. So kind of how that paper specifically defines secure hardware, saying that it refers to computing equipment, hardware, that is designed to protect data and computation, especially from other processes running on that equipment, right? So basically preventing like data leaks from one section of the actual physical device to another, as an example, right? And so you can either do this through having a separate module, so it's completely separate from anything else, it's its own thing, that's what your CBDC device, whatever happens to be, right? And then there's also could be something called a trusted execution environment, which is basically, like, from my understanding at least, it's a specific section in the actual device itself that basically has limitations placed on it for what type of code, or what code in general can be executed in that section of the physical device itself, right? And why this is might be seen as kind of important, not so much the trusted execution environment, but more of having a more hardware-based kind of security, I guess we'll say, process for CBDC, is it could be more important for offline transactions. It just seems like there would be less, or I guess I should say, it would be easier to implement offline transactions, and possibly even peer-to-peer to a certain extent, for your CBDC, if it was more hardware-based rather than software-based. It just seems like there would be less problems that would arise, at least superficially, without further discussion, which is also the purpose of these videos. So feel free to comment and everything. That's the whole point of these in general. It just seems like having a more hardware-based solution to this would be, it would have less roadblocks to have offline or peer-to-peer kind of transactions in general. So what are some of the, I guess, more structured pros and cons of having a more hardware-based solution to a CBDC, right? According to the paper. So basically they say it'll be more secure, it'd be better for securing cryptographic keys and certifying code performance. Could also secure hardware, could be where encrypted transactions take place, which is where AML and CFT compliance arises, right? AML and CFT compliance is anti-money laundering and counter-financing terrorism. Talked about this a few times in other videos throughout the playlist. It's a central bank digital currency. So anytime you have some form of, we'll say, quasi-government entity in this case, at least in the American case, where it's the Federal Reserve, but there would be, in general, and not just looking country-specific, governments are going to be involved, right? It's not like it's kind of a small move to begin with. So they're going to push AML, CFT compliance all the time. That's what it's always going to be like that, is pretty much all I'm going to say about it. I've reiterated that point so many times. I feel like it's rather mute at this point. But anyways, so another pro would be additional limitations on illicit activity, going back on the compliance, while minimizing privacy risk to individuals. Again, whether or not that's kind of the case, I'll leave more up to further discussion and for you guys to decide on your own after you read the paper. I don't want to, the whole point of these videos isn't to specifically, like, you know, kind of craft my, or not to word, I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this. It's not to shove my own opinion down your throat, right? It's kind of just putting out, this is what I found, and provoking further discussion for it and to gain a better understanding in general, right? For the people who watch this and for myself as well to a certain extent, right? And so, and kind of the final pro we'll say is it could add another layer of security to the CBDC system on top of other layers, whether that be looking at PKC, so public key cryptography, having that in there as well, or other kind of software-based solutions that may be added as well. Because nothing says it has to be purely hardware for security or purely software, right? It's kind of, you can have a mixture of both, and it probably optimally would be a kind of combined, I don't know, teamwork between the two, for lack of a better term, right? So now kind of looking at some of the cons of having a more hardware-based solution, right, is it may harm financial inclusion, as you could probably tell from the title of the video, right, is if you actually have to buy this separate module or whatever. Now, I would be surprised if you personally would have to buy it to use it, because that would be a major disincentive, and they're all about user adoption. That's one of the major kind of concerns for it in general, right? And so if you are to have this, or if we have to use the CBDC to do anything, so to say, then most likely, I guess, issue it to you. And also from kind of the whole them being able to control and deal with these, like the AML and CFT compliance stuff, it'd just be easier if they issued it to you in general. At least that's what initially comes to mind when thinking this through, right? And so another one would be secure hardware sometimes still shares hardware with other parts of the system, which is where these possible data leaks could come through. Also, you could physically manipulate the hardware. That's another way to do it. I can't say, I guess this is more personal, but anyone who has kind of like a technological background in any form or fashion, or was ever interested, it seems, especially as a kid, and I've fallen prey to this a few times, is you just want to take it apart and understand. You physically modify and manipulate everything that you can, if you're curious in it, especially if you don't know all like the stickers and stuff on the back that you're not supposed to open it, and you just ignore that when you're young, I guess. At least younger, we'll say, in your childhood. I did. But anyways, another con could be it could increase systemic risks, as secure hardware is only developed by a few key players. And so basically talking about like actually sourcing like the modules or the material to make them in general. And then also it would produce a large incentive for those throughout the supply chain and end users to exploit the system to mint unlimited CBDCs, right? And this is talked about a few times in the paper, where you're basically like able to double spend, right? The coins, or whatever you want to call them, the tokens, whatever it happens to be, right? However they decide to kind of formulate and use their diction for this in general, right? That's really where it's going with the whole double spending problem, or at least from what I've gathered from reading their papers, is basically being able to mint your own CBDC through the device or whatever it happens to be, right? And this is why we're kind of trying to put it out there and discuss it, trying to understand it a little bit better, so to say. But with that being said, that's pretty much all I have for the hardware-based solution. And so I'll put a card up in the top right for the more software-based solution. Not as much to that, because it's kind of more intertwined with everything else, and whereas the more hardware-based one is kind of more set on its own and not as intertwined with other US CBDC design choices, I think is a good way to say it. But anyways, I'll leave it there, and I hope to see you guys there.